Thank you, Mike, and thank you, Kat, for having me today. So we're talking about 1340 Penn and Margaret or Molly Brown, and we think her story really reflects the changing role of women in society, and she can stand to represent some of the tens of thousands of women who, over the span of 70 plus years, demanded the right to vote. Today, I'm going to share with you how we use her story to learn about the role of women in the West and the role they played in the national fight for suffrage, and discover some of the more militant tactics of the Congressional Union or National Women's Party as they were later known. So there will definitely be no pink tea here today. As you can see, pink tea politics suggested a frivolous engagement with political change, especially with women from the upper echelons of society like Margaret Brown, like Anne Evans. So these pink teas were socially acceptable ways for women to strategize and pursue the right to vote. So that's sort of where the origin of pink tea comes from. And of course, in British society, they would actually serve pink tea. They had a special leaf of tea that they used, and then they put a pinch of baking soda in it and it would turn it pink. So they would literally make their tea pink to sort of, put the men off from participating in their tea so they could talk politics. So every day at the Molly Brown House Museum, we ask ourselves, how do we know what we know? In a time of sort of post-truth and hashtag fake news, we continually seek out new primary source materials so that we can separate fact from fiction and so that we can better understand the true story of Margaret Tobin Brown, as opposed to the fictionalized version of her, Molly Brown, that so many of us first come to know her as. So you're going to see a lot of those source materials today. But like women like Margaret in the late Victorian period, they were forming social organizations, women's clubs, and literary societies that generated the opportunities to engage in community work. So these pink tea associations proved to be breeding grounds for the suffrage movement. So when Margaret moved to Leadville, Colorado from her home state of Hannibal, Missouri, there was a chapter of the National American Women's Suffrage Association already there, formed in 1893 by Mary C. Bradford. So it's likely a young Margaret attended those meetings. 10 years later, when she moves to Denver, she becomes a member of the Denver Women's Press Club. And then Mary Bradford was also active in the Jane Jefferson Democratic Club, which is the oldest organized women's political club in the nation. And we'll hear about more about them later. After moving to Denver and becoming a part of the Denver Women's Club, which was led by Sarah Platt Decker, Margaret was chairing the Arts and Literature Committee, which prided itself on building Riverfront Park, playgrounds and summer schools and orphanages and all sorts of social systems that hadn't been put in place in Denver yet. So it really is the spirit of the West that Margaret is coming to Colorado from Missouri. So it was out here in the West, as you know, state by state, where women first gained enfranchisement. After a defeat in 1876, the Colorado Equal Suffrage Association campaigned for over a decade. To win the vote, Colorado women went door to door, organized letter writing campaigns, and took part in speaking tours. And as a result, Colorado was the first state by referendum to give women the right to vote in 1893, after Wyoming Territory and Utah Territory had given women the right to vote in their states. So Alice Meredith here in Colorado really was seen as the architect of Colorado's passage of women's suffrage. She was nicknamed the Susan B. Anthony of Colorado. She even went to Chicago and championed with Susan B. Anthony to help with suffrage out here. She would join the staff of the Rocky Mountain News in 1889 and was a longtime editor of a column titled Woman's World. As these images and articles illustrate that you can see on the screen, the women of the West were now being looked to as a powerful tool for achieving national suffrage. The billboard at the bottom you can see was paid for by the National Women's Party as part of this Western strategy. After the successful Colorado campaign, Alice Meredith became a resource on the topic of women's suffrage, and she continued to write and speak about what it meant to the women of Colorado to have the right to vote. You also see one of the articles, there's no reason why every woman should not enter politics. That's John Shafroth, who was a senator at the time here in Colorado. So the political machine out here in the West, out here in Colorado, was being looked to as champions for suffrage, so not just the women. Another woman we'll get to know today, Helen Ring Robinson, was also an active member of the Denver community, and like Margaret Brown, she participated in the Denver Women's Club and Denver Women's Press Club. The Denver Women's Press Club is still there, and it's just a block away from the Molly Brown House. In 1912, Robinson became the first woman elected to the Colorado State Senate, and as Senator Robinson was concerned with labor reform and even worked with Margaret Brown to resolve the Ludlow conflict in 1914. So actually, mistaken newspaper reports in early 1914 had pitted Margaret against Robinson in a race for the Senate, but in fact, Robinson had intended to keep her state seat, while Margaret aimed for one of Colorado's 2 national seats. Later that year, Robinson and Mrs. Brown would be in Newport for the Marble House Conference. We'll also learn about that in a bit. So, Mrs. James J. Brown of Denver had been in the news all spring of 1914 for her offer to lead a regiment of fighting women in the impending war with Mexico. Yes, she was going to lead a regiment of women to Mexico to fight. She had to pivot and respond to the miners' strike that was happening in southern Colorado. Women like Mother Jones, Helen Ring Robinson all responded to this miners' strike. It turned deadly, of course, in the spring of 1914, and Margaret came back west from Newport to respond and help out. She then went on a speaking tour and really focused on the situation of miners here in Colorado and their need for improved conditions and equal rights. She would hold salons and conduct a whistle-stop speaking tour around the state. So word is starting to get out that Mrs. Brown is considering a bid for office here in Colorado. And when asked by reporters, she says, "If I go into this fight, I am going to win," she said. "There will be no mincing matters and no pink tea policies. It will be a regular man's kind of campaign, stump speaking, spread eagle and all." In other words, she's not messing around. This isn't those sort of delicate conversations about politics. She's going to dive right into it. So an original newspaper article shown here on the left is an interview with Margaret Brown regarding her 1914 campaign for U.S. Senate. In this article, there's a series of cartoons that show Margaret playing polo, boxing with her son Larry. I love that little Larry there. And presenting her credentials to the Senate over a fence with a sign on it that says, "Women keep out." So this article actually comes from an important scrapbook that was donated to the museum by the Vollrath and Marinholtz family. And it contains firsthand documentation about Margaret Brown's family life, her achievements, and the significant role she played in major national and international affairs. It was collected by her niece, Helen Tobin Koger, who was with Brown in the summer of 1914. If you follow us on Instagram, you'll know that Helen was named Newport's most beautiful girl of the season. Helen was still under her aunt's wing that summer. Her mother had passed away from an illness when Helen was just 5 years old. So she and her 3 siblings, Grace, Frank, and Florence, were left in the care of Margaret and JJ, who raised them as if they were their own children. So Helen lived with her aunt here at the Denver house and then at their Newport cottage on Bellevue Avenue, which Margaret called Monet Twee. In Newport, they would mingle with Gilded Age elite, including Alva Vanderbilt Belmont, who was, of course, at the forefront of Newport high society and the suffrage movement. So in this cartoon too, she is presenting to the Senate a list of her credentials, and those credentials include traveler, sociologist, and suffragette. And it shows that she, of course, plays polo, is boxing with her son. She also taught him how to swim, and that she bent to the oar in the Titanic disaster. So she'd already been noticed by Eastern suffragists back in 1912 in the wake of the Titanic. So the Women's Journal published this multi-page article that linked the suffrage cause and the Titanic. "When women cannot vote," the article says, "the ship of state is like the steamship Titanic with only half enough lifeboats." So, of course, with only half the population able to vote, this ship state will sink under such monstrous perils, and you can see them in the water as saloons, gambling, that's the octopus there, smallpox, child labor, and poverty. So all of those are going to pull down the ship of state if women don't get the right to vote. So author is Alice Stone Blackwell, who is the daughter of founders and first-generation suffragists Lucy Stone and Henry Blackwell. She mentions Mrs. Brown as a chivalrous voter who survived, and says that an effort has been made in some quarters to deduce from the wreck of the Titanic an argument against votes for women. So that's what's called out in that box there. It is absurd to fancy that chivalry is a tribute rendered by a voter to a non-voter as a sort of offset for the lack of the ballot. So this is the conversation that's happening in 1912, and how they're tying the Titanic disaster and Margaret Brown into this larger cause for suffrage. And you also see another familiar name down there. So on the masthead of the Women's Journal, you'll also see that a contributing editor was Ellis Meredith, our own woman here from Colorado. She was a writer, served as the first woman elected to the Denver Elections Commission. By 1917, later in our story of suffrage, Meredith would move to Washington, D.C. and take a job with the Women's Bureau of the Democratic Party. And she continued to be an active member of the National Democratic Club. So Alice Meredith was always in the thick of it. So fast forward a couple of years to 1914, the Women's Journal also covered Brown's Senate bid. Her friends, Judge Ben Lindsey, Senator Robinson, and Alva Belmont, as well as many here in Colorado, New York, and Rhode Island, all supported her run for U.S. Senate. This bid was to take U.S. Senator Thomas's seat, and it was in the wake of the incident near Ludlow. Margaret was seen as being in a unique position to mediate for the miners, because she was seen as a leader by Colorado women, but she also knew John D. Rockefeller socially, and they were hoping she could bend his ear. She tried at first not to take sides, and there's even a great quote that says, "I'm not here to take sides. She's just here to do her duty impartially." But ultimately, she did support the miners against the Rockefellers and used her fame to put pressure on them to concede, which of course they never really did make any concessions. Eastern suffrage leaders were inquiring about Mrs. Brown's credentials, including Maud Howe Elliott, who was leader of the Newport Suffrage League, and again, Alice Stone Blackwell. They corresponded together in reference to the Women's Journal article that you see in the lower left corner that says Mrs. Brown may be a US Senator. And in this article, Alice Stone Blackwell upholds her as the right kind of suffragist. And in the central article dated July 23rd, 1914, that says Senator's toga would fit her, we see one of many references to her niece, Helen Tobin, who collected the scrapbook. It says that she is opposed to suffrage. So this younger generation is opposed and doesn't know, quote, how Auntie expects to get any fun out of being a senator. So she sees her aunt's ambition as maybe being boring. The three nieces and Brown's own daughter, Helen, didn't see the point of women's suffrage, and it's reflected again and again in newspaper articles and letters. Perhaps it's due to the greater social freedoms that they had over their mom's generation. We're not quite sure. In another article shown here, Mrs. Brown says, "It is the most propitious time to send a woman to Congress. It will be a great service to women in the East." And when she was asked about the more militant English suffragists, she replied, "Well, they have tried for 20 years to get what they want with sugar, and now they have adopted men's methods." So she's saying, you know what, they might have to resort to these militant tactics. So this is all unfurling over the summer of 1914, when suffrage leaders, including Brown, gather from across the US for a conference of great women. It's being held at the Newport, Rhode Island home of Alva Belmont, Marble House, and includes admission to her new Chinese tea pavilion that she had erected on the grounds. So in the spirit of Seneca Falls, suffrage leaders and politicians from across the country attended, including Senator Robinson, who stayed with Margaret at her home, Monet Tweed. During the conference, Margaret also hosted at her cottage a speech by dear old friend Judge Ben Lindsey. The main speaker and attendee was the Duchess of Marlborough, who was Belmont's daughter. And it was she who had been Alva's first exposure to the suffrage movement in England. And speakers at the Conference of Great Women also included Florence Kelley, who was a political reformer and then head of the Consumer League, who spoke on child labor, Rose Schneiderman of the National Women's Trade Union, Catherine B. Davis, who was then Commissioner of Corrections, Harriet Stanton Blatch, daughter of Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and then president of the Women's Political Union. So there was a very prestigious list of women in attendance and as speakers at this suffrage event. So both Lindsey and Robinson were asked to address the militia strike at Ludlow, as well as Colorado's passage of suffrage. Robinson opened her address, and that's her down in the lower left corner speaking at the conference. She opened her address by stating that, "Neighbors, I want to feel free to tell you unpleasant things. The shame of Colorado is your shame, your problem, just as truly as our problem." And she ended by saying that it is men's duty to see that the wheels of industry go round, but women must see that there shall be no blood on the wheels. And as the Colorado Encyclopedia shares with us, Robinson decided not to seek re-election in 1916, 2 years later. She chose instead to be a spokesperson for suffrage, traveled to other states, and advocated at both the state and national levels for suffrage. She would go on to write Preparing Women for Citizenship, which was published in 1918, in order to educate the female voters. She really wanted to emphasize the need for women to rethink their roles in society and use their right to advocate for human rights rather than profit, as she had seen over and over again in Colorado with industrialists putting profit above of human life and human experience. So a month after this conference, which took place in July, the Congressional Union, which was a group off of a National American Women's Suffrage Association that Alice Paul had been put in charge of, they convened their own conference, and attendees included Alva Belmont, who was the financier of this group, as well as Alice Paul, Lucy Burns, and Doris Stevens, but also such notable attendees as Inez Mulholland, who you may know was the famed beauty on the horse in the 1913 parade on DC. Also Dr. Cora Smith King of the National Council of Women Voters, Harriet Stanton Blatch and Florence Kelly again, and women from dozens of regional suffrage associations. And then, of course, Colorado's own Senator Robinson and Margaret Brown were on the guest list. You can actually see some of these papers are from the Library of Congress, and then some are from the Schlesinger Library, where some of Doris Stevens, her papers are kept. So you can see her handwritten notes of the guest list for this Congressional Union Conference. And on the far right there, you can actually see at the top of the list, it says Brown, Mrs. JJ, and scratched out and added in by hand, it says Colorado prominently mentioned for Congress. So this is all in Doris Stevens' handwriting. And then you can see sort of the program for that two-day conference. And then in the left, you can see women including Alva Belmont and Doris Stevens as they set up their Congressional Union headquarters for the summer. And then down below, you can see Doris Stevens writing a note to Alice Paul talking about how Mrs. J.J. Brown is going to bring refreshments and host one of the parties. So all of these are great little clues that tell us some of the day-to-day activities, as well as the players who are present at these very important meetings. So at this conference, Lucy Burns spoke, and she pointed out that the president had 7 times refused to aid the movement, and that the Democratic caucus had taken definite action against the suffrage amendment by declaring that suffrage was not a question for national consideration. So we're starting to see that they're eyeing the Democratic Party here for not supporting national suffrage. Alice Paul spoke, and in her remarks, she said, quote, "We are all, I think, agreed that it is the Democratic Party which is responsible for the blocking of the suffrage amendment." And she says, "The question is whether we are good enough politicians to take the 4 million votes that we have in the West and organize them and use them so as to win the vote for the women who are still disenfranchised." She said, "We would issue an appeal signed by influential women of the East, addressed to the women voters as a whole, asking them to use their vote this one time in the national election against the Democratic Party throughout the whole 9 states. When we have once effected the result in a national election, no party will trifle with suffrage any longer." So she has an agenda that she's spelling out here. So as you can read in this letter from Alice Paul to Senator Robinson, who had to return early to Colorado, Paul relates that the Congressional Union planned to conduct their 1914 election campaigns in suffrage states only and appealed to the women voters to withhold their support from the Democratic Party. In this letter, Paul says that this is the first time that suffragists ever entered a national political election, and that with 1/5 of the Senate, 1/7 of the House, and 1/6 of the electoral votes coming from suffrage states, such leverage, she says, could make possible speedy passage of federal suffrage. So here again, for the first time, she's demonstrating she's going to punish the party in power and make them responsible for their slowness in which suffrage work is progressing at a national level. And these are tactics she pulled from her time working in the British suffrage movement in England. So what happened to Mrs. Brown's Senate bid, you ask? So her bid really is entangled in this nuanced final push for national women's suffrage. So these competing approaches, of course, were splitting suffrages between the National American Women's Suffrage Association, at the time was headed up by Dr. Anna Howard Shaw, and then finally by Carrie Chapman Catt, and the Congressional Union, headed by Paul Burns and Stevens. So the Congressional Union was again following this British approach to punish the party in power for not supporting suffrage. So as a Democrat, Thomas's seat was under fire, but those back in Colorado, like Bertha Fowler, Ellis Meredith, they knew that Thomas was actually pro-suffrage. So as you can see in this headline, Dr. Shaw, then president of NASA, told reporters that Brown's bid was nothing short of treason. And she said, Miss Paul and Miss Burns have the greatest lack of political sagacity in campaigning against Senator Thomas. And in response to Mrs. Brown saying that in a newspaper article, she wasn't ready to sit down at 40 and mildew, Shaw retorts, she doesn't want to mildew. She better keep out of the US Senate. So she had a pretty sharp wit, that woman. In a letter to Congressional Union's Doris Stevens, which you can see there on the right, on the left, Ellis Meredith related, she said, now about Mrs. Brown. She is a good sort, only please refrain from campaigning against Senator Thomas. He was our friend before we had the suffrage, when friends were scarcer and more valuable. So there's our Ellis Meredith, our Susan B. Anthony of Colorado saying, don't campaign against Senator Thomas. So in a letter on the right, Stevens is writing to Lucy Burns in response to Dr. Shaw's cry of treason. She's denying any official endorsement by the CU, and Stevens relates her telephone call to Brown, which that's pretty cool in itself that they're talking on the phone, where Brown denies the statement, but Stevens believes that the impression had been made regardless. So whether or not that endorsement happened, we may never know. So as you can see by that small article at the bottom, Brown decided not to run. So this is based on the advice of Ellis Meredith, Senator Robinson, who's on the ground here in Colorado and taking the pulse of the voters and constituents, and perhaps even that of Doris Stevens after that phone conversation. And at this time too, the Bristow, Mondale, and Shafroth-Palmer suffrage bills were both up for vote. And while there were more state-by-state approaches, Mrs. Brown didn't want to upset the apple cart back here in Colorado by running against Senator Thomas. And of course, we also have war brewing in Europe. So Mrs. Brown's attentions were divided and then drawn to France, along with cohorts like Anne Morgan and Anne Harriman Vanderbilt, all who went to France and began setting up nursing stations, then driving ambulance, and then after the war, helping to rebuild France. So Mrs. Brown sort of exits stage left at this time, but that certainly doesn't mean that Colorado doesn't have a very strong role moving forward. And we're going to talk about that next. So most of you have probably seen this image. I think it's one of the most iconic images of the suffrage movement, especially when we are voters here in the West. So this really represents how this large voting population of women in the West are being looked to by women in the East, saying, help us get the right to vote, help us push through this national amendment. So this image is so iconic. And then I wanted to share with you another letter between Doris Stevens and Alva Belmont. So Doris actually set out in late 1914 after the Congressional Union meetings had wrapped up, and she began to work out here in the West. In a letter to Belmont, Stevens is requesting that she be connected to some of Denver's social elite. Specifically, as you can see here in the second sentence, Mrs. Crawford Hill. And many of you may know Mrs. Crawford Hill as being Mrs. Brown's sort of social nemesis. While we don't know conclusively what kind of relationship Brown and Hill had, we do know that Hill paid Molly Brown biographer Carolyn Bancroft handsomely to write favorably about her, therefore disfavorably about Brown. So who knows what their relationship was like. So in this letter, Stevens also relates, and it's in this sort of second to the last paragraph. She's relating an evening dinner party spent with Judge Lindsey, who apparently regaled guests with stories of what he said was the irrepressible Mrs. Brown and her trying eccentricities. So make of that what you will, but I would have loved to hear what they were saying about Mrs. Brown. So in her personal notes then, you can see where Doris Stevens outlines her sort of strategy for the rest of 1914 in her time in Denver. At the bottom, you can see how Mrs. Brown's bid against Thomas and even Dr. Shaw's denouncement seemed to follow Stevens to Colorado. It's hard to make out the handwriting, so I think it says, first attempt to organize voting women to chastise congressmen on suffrage issues, and it took a week before she knew of Senator Thomas, so and his campaign and how it was the suffrage was being talked about. So Colorado was turning out to be a tougher state than they thought. So to Paul, she writes of Colorado Democrats. So here's a letter from Doris Stevens to Alice Paul. She writes about how both the Colorado Dems and the Republicans are both adopting national suffrage planks for the first time. And that in the letter too, she talks about how Thomas appears to be unbeatable. And then in this last paragraph, she says, the press is really dreadful here. And she says, not one paper has any genuine interest in our fight. The Post, she says, had the most terrible story in it, in which I posed as a speaker. She said it was a hot anti-Thomas article for which I was not responsible. So by the summer of 1915, the state headquarters were relocated to Colorado Springs. So here you can see a map outlining Paul's Western envoy route as a political strategy and publicity strategy, where the Congressional Union is remaking themselves. They're in the process of sort of remaking themselves as the National Women's Party in order to further distance themselves from sort of their NASA roots. And in the bottom left photo, you can see some of the women involved in the Colorado National Women's Party efforts, including Bertha Fowler, who is the tallest woman. And the second from the left is Harriet Stanton Blatch, who helped oversee the Colorado National Women's Party operations from her new home in Kansas. Blatch had left the East after her women's political union failed to see suffrage pass in New York. And despite mobilizing New York's working class women, which is what Blatch was best at. And then in the bottom right, you can see Dr. Carolyn Spencer, who was a retired physician. She's the one that persuaded Paul that Colorado Springs was a superior location for the headquarters over Denver. And working with Paul, Spencer was one of the primary organizers for the National Women's Party. And then a nationally publicized event atop Pikes Peak, Spencer actually raised a National Women's Party flag to announce publicly that this was a new organization. In 1916, the National Women's Party held a conference at the Hotel Antlers in Colorado Springs to formulate a policy for the coming presidential campaign. So in Washington, D.C., those senators and representatives read the newspaper accounts daily of this convention. And Democratic leaders appealed to President Wilson to counterattack what was being said by the suffragists here in Colorado. The president then very quickly dispatched a letter to the Jane Jefferson Club of Denver, which we learned earlier. And the letter was actually read at a banquet the last day of the conference. He began, President Wilson, by complimenting the club for their work in the cause of democracy. But then Wilson goes on to say that Those who believe in equal suffrage are divided into those who believe that each state should determine for itself when and in what direction the suffrage should be extended, and those who believe that it should be immediately extended by the action of the national government by means of an amendment to the federal constitution. He goes on to say, I do not see how candidates can consistently disregard these official declarations through state action. He said, I shall endeavor to make the declaration of my own party in this matter effectual by every influence that I can properly and legitimately exercise. But if you sort of dig deep into these words, he's still talking about state action, not a federal amendment. So with no suffrage amendment passed and the US on the cusp of war, by early 1917, the National Women's Party became the first group to protest en masse in front of the White House. The Silent Sentinels became a daily reminder to Wilson of his party's lack of support for suffrage, as well as his apparent hypocrisy when calling for democracy in Europe while denying the same democratic principles to half of America's population. So the protesters were, of course, called the Silent Sentinels because they protested without speaking a word. They stood there 6 days a week, hours on end with their signs. And throughout their 2-year vigil, nearly 2,000 women picketed. Hundreds were arrested and many were jailed. They were beaten. They went on hunger strikes. They were force-fed and unjustly treated by authorities in DC. When police started to arrest the pickets, as they were known, on June 22nd, 1917, police arrested Lucy Burns, who's on the top left corner, and Catherine Morey. They were arrested on obstructing traffic, and they were sentenced to 3 days in jail or pay a $10 fine. They chose jail. And on July 14th, 16 women were arrested, and again, they chose jail. And on July 14th, more women were arrested and sentenced to jail. Lucy Burns would actually argue that they should be treated as political prisoners, but that designation had yet to be used. So the Colorado National Women's Party suffragists were a big part of the Silent Sentinels, including the 3 women you see here, Natalie Gray, Bertha Arnold, and Dr. Spencer. Dr. Spencer was arrested 3 times and twice imprisoned. And this is a woman who is having health problems and is in her 50s at this point. Dr. Spencer said, the tyranny of half the race over the other half is the first wrong to be righted, and its overthrow the greatest revolution conceivable. So she meant business. It was in early October 1917 that Spencer and Alice Paul were carrying banners toward the White House. Paul carried a banner with the words of President Wilson, which had recently appeared on posters for the Liberty Bond of 1917. And those words were, the time has come to conquer or submit. For us, there can be but one choice. We have made it. And Dr. Spencer's banner bore the watchwords of 76, and those words were, resistance to tyranny is obedience to God. Both women were arrested, and the judge found them guilty of obstructing traffic like the other women, but he suspended their sentence and threatened a severe penalty if they reappeared in his court. Paul and Spencer immediately returned to the picket line, were rearrested, and then sentenced to 7 months in the Occoquan workhouse. Paul herself was placed in solitary confinement for 2 weeks with nothing to eat. She became weak and was taken to the prison hospital. It was there where she began her hunger strike and others joined her. This is the point at which they were force-fed by putting tubes down their throat. And one physician reported that Alice Paul had a spirit like Joan of Arc and is useless to try to change it. She will die, he said, but she will never give up. And of course, many of you may know of the Night of Terror, which happened in November of 1917, where the superintendent of the workhouse ordered the guards to brutalize the suffragists. They would chain the women to their cell bars or their beds. They would beat them and throw them into the cell doors and knock them out. So all of this is happening as, of course, war is being declared. And finally, in 1918, the House of Representatives narrowly passes the Susan B. Anthony Amendment, but the Senate would refuse to debate it until October, when it then failed by 2 votes. And in spite of a ruling by the DC Circuit Court of Appeals, arrests continued. To keep up the pressure, these women started burning Wilson's words in watchfires in front of the in front of the White House or at Lafayette Fountain. And they even burned Wilson's image in effigy. Dr. Carolyn Spencer and was one of those women. And then at the bottom, you can see Bertha Arnold actually at one of those watch fires. So they continue to burn words and Wilson's image as part of the protest. And Paul, as part of her publicity, was urging citizens to vote against anti-suffrage senators up for election in the fall. After the 19 election, most members of Congress were now pro-suffrage. So it was a long 4 years in this strategy, but they finally managed to flip seats. So in May and June of 1919, the House and Senate both passed the amendment and sent it on for ratification. And on August 18th, 1920, the needed 3/4 of the state legislators ratified the 19th Amendment, gaining women full voting rights. I encourage you, if you haven't heard this story, read about Harry Burns and the Tennessee ratification of the 19th Amendment. It's a great story. So the effort of these countless women, whether they were pink tea or militant, really brought the movement to fruition with the ratification. I would be remiss, though, if I don't mention the scores of Black suffragists who fought for the cause of suffrage, while also simultaneously being confronted with sort of entrenched and systemic racism through Jim Crow laws. Elizabeth Piper Ensley here in Colorado was a Black suffragist. And then Mary Church Terrell actually joined the Silent Sentinels. And then our Ida B. Wells, of course, defied all by marching with the Chicago delegates in the 1913 parade. So many African-American women would, of course, not see their voting rights won until 1965 with the Voting Rights Act. So that's always a whole nother lecture, but I wanted to mention those ladies. So now it's our turn. Margaret Brown herself once said, "There's something in the atmosphere of Colorado that inspires you." And I think that's why Alice Paul made this part of her sort of Western strategy, why they had a National Women's Party headquarters here. And that's why women like Dr. Carolyn Spencer and Bertha Arnold and Natalie Gray, Elizabeth Piper Ensley, all of these amazing women fought so fiercely for the 19th Amendment. So I would say, and I hope you agree, that it was most certainly not pink tea politics that finally won women the right to vote. But instead, I think the tireless fight of generations of women, I think they learned how to create a level playing field, or certainly more level, in order to lobby and campaign and march and protest, and of course, even silently plead for their rightful place in democracy. Margaret herself not only survived the Titanic, but she survived another ship sinking off the coast of India. She survived a hotel fire in Miami, the 1918 pandemic, and World War I as an ambulance driver. So I hope you too can channel her unsinkable spirit in this challenging time. Mike's allowing me a few minutes to do a pitch, so we hope you visit mollybrown.org. You can learn about our current exhibit on suffrage called Fierce Foremother Steadfast Suffragists, which you see up on the screen. That runs through the end of September. You can also on our website purchase tour tickets if you live here in Denver and you feel safe coming out to visit us. We just ask that you pre-purchase your tickets. And of course, like Margaret, you wear your mask when you come to the museum. You're also welcome to make a donation to the museum to help support our mission and inspire and inform today's social justice warriors, just like these brave and strong women. If you live in the neighborhood and you're out for a Safer in the Outdoors walk, we also have a free outdoor exhibit from the National Archives called Rightfully Hers that's all about the 19th Amendment anniversary. And we've also added on our own panel about Colorado's role and Colorado's enfranchisement of women voters. So the last screen I have are some of the sources that I would encourage you to look at. You can read about almost moment by moment this final push for national suffrage. There are two great books. You can find them online or you can purchase them. The first one is The Story of the Women's Party by Inez Haynes Irwin, and that's actually a free Gutenberg book you can read online. The next one I will encourage you to read is Jailed for Freedom by Doris Stevens, of course, of Congressional Union or National Women's Party. And you can really get that firsthand daily account of their efforts. And then to learn more about some of the fierce women we had here in Colorado, there's Extraordinary Women of the Rocky Mountain West. And there's a great chapter, Carolyn Spencer and Radicals for Reform, written by Chris Nickel. And then the National Women's Party Archives and the Library of Congress Archives both have great information right now all about the full breadth of the push for suffrage. And then you can dive a little bit deeper into Doris Stevens, her papers at the Schlesinger Library, Radcliffe Institute, which they have many of those online. And of course, our own Molly Brown House Museum archives as well. So lots to learn and research about. And if you come to the museum and see our exhibit, Fierce Foremothers, Steadfast Suffragists, you'll of course learn about Mrs. Brown's involvement in this national push. So thank you so much for sharing some time with me today to learn about Mrs. Brown. And I'll turn it back to you, Mike.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Andrea. That was such a wealth of information and very well put together. I mean, I could spend a really long time looking at every slide on this slideshow. But I did have a couple questions here. One of the first ones is, this is only really just a glimpse of Margaret Brown's life. And it's so insane how detailed that this one part of her life really offers. Now, being said, do you think there's anything in Margaret's history before this time period that really encouraged her to be such a staunch suffragist?
I think we can take it actually all the way back to her parents. Her parents were both sort of outspoken social advocates in their own right, which is sort of unheard of for Irish immigrants looking to assimilate into American culture. They were both active in various things. Her father was tied up in the Harper's Ferry incident somehow, even though we can't really find good primary source evidence beyond just sort of family oral history. And then Margaret's mother's had ties to O'Donovan Rossa, who was an Irish sort of freedom fighter who was here in the US for a while. And then her parents instilled in all of their children the necessity of a good education. So educational attainment was very important to the Tobin family. So rather than sending their kids off to work at the age of 12 or 13, they put them in school for additional years to increase their education. So it really began in the home as children. And then I think, of course, once Mrs. Brown, once they made their wealth and they moved here to Denver, she saw that rather than sort of sit around and crochet or whatever, she could actually put her money and her time to use to improve the lives of those around her in Denver, and those below or beyond her social class. So that's when she really got involved with Judge Lindsey and his juvenile court and reform system. So she really became one of his primary fundraisers. So I think it was just baked in from the beginning.
Yeah, that's awesome. And so many things that she would have gone through that I think really built upon what, her personality offers us today. Now, this one is referencing some of the collection that you showed. Now, what collection, possibly if you know now, but I can connect you after if we need to, what collection did the letter from Ellis to Doris Stevens come from? Do you know
That's in the Library of Congress archives, actually. And I know History Colorado now has a substantial Ellis Meredith collection, so contact them if you want to learn so many amazing things about Ellis Meredith. Including, I think there's correspondence between Ellis and Susan B. Anthony, so there's great archives at History Colorado, but that letter in particular is from Library of Congress.
Awesome. There's so much in your presentation, and just shows that there's so much, and seeing all these names connecting is just really inspiring. But then another question here from Leslie is there a particular biography of Margaret Brown that you would recommend if we only want to read one?
We still recommend, even though it is almost 20 years old at this point, we still recommend Dr. Kristen Iverson's Unraveling the Myth. It just is a great look at sort of the breadth of her life and getting to understand she was so much more than the myth of Molly, and we need to sort of set that myth aside now and understand that the real life story of Margaret Brown is so much more inspirational, and she accomplished so much for a woman of her time. And that is just gets obscured when you're only dealing with the myth of Molly Brown. So we recommend Unraveling the Myth. Of course, if you go to mollybrown.org and find our blog that is written by staff and very well researched, you can learn all about all of these different facets of Margaret Brown's life too.
Awesome. And I read that book. It's a really well-written book, and it really gives you a cool perspective from all the myths that are apparent in her lifetime. But then we have a question from Heather about her nieces. Did her nieces eventually change their attitudes towards suffrage?
We're really not sure, because unfortunately, most of the nieces sort of didn't have a full life. Helen actually died quite young. She was in her 40s when she passed away. And then Grace and Florence as well died on the younger side. So that side of the family, those family lines sort of stopped with them. So beyond the collected scrapbook, we really don't have much information, but it really is so fascinating to see that these three girls as the nieces and the daughter Helen. So you have four girls growing up in this household with a mom who's very outspoken, who advocates for all of these rights and social injustices she sees around her. And they're kind of like, meh, whatever, we get to, as young women at that time, they get to smoke cigarettes and they get to drink alcohol and they get to ride around in cars. They have these amazing freedoms that, their mom/aunt's generation didn't have. So I wonder if just those social freedoms made them sort of uninterested or didn't see the need to have the right to vote.
I mean, I wonder too, if I was living in Newport, Rhode Island and hanging out with the cream de la cream, I don't know. But Mona says here, fabulous presentation. But given how anti-suffragists used the Titanic disaster to argue that only chivalrous men deserve the vote, did Margaret Brown face public attack for her status as a Titanic survivor?
That's a great question. I'm trying to think if I've ever seen any account where she was sort of being taken to for being a survivor, and I don't think so. Of course, the men who survived were taken to account, for having survived, especially if you were an upper class man. But Margaret really was able to use the Titanic disaster as a platform from the first minute she stepped off the boat. There is a newspaper interview with her in New York City. It's less than 24 hours since they've gotten off the Carpathia, and she's being interviewed. And you can, in the tone of her voice and the words that she's using, her grief and her shock is palpable. And she's got this young Russian woman who's lost everything, literally clinging to her out of her own grief and sort of shock of the experience. And I think it took time for it all to settle in, but then Margaret got mad, about what had happened and how unnecessary it was. I mean, this is my favorite quote of Margaret. She says, "The Titanic disaster was as unnecessary as running the Brown Palace into Pikes Peak." It shouldn't have happened. So I don't think she ever faced criticism for having survived or for being sort of in the tangle of the aftermath of the Titanic. And she made it her life's cause to recognize the people who passed away or gave their lives for those that did survive through countless memorials and wreath laying and things like that.
Awesome. All right, so we'll just have time for a couple more questions here. But Katie does say thank you for such an interesting presentation. Can you provide more insight into why the suffrage movement experienced greater early traction in the Western versus the Eastern United States, at least from your point of view?
Yeah, from my point of view, I think Rebecca Hunt's on the call and other people who can probably speak better to this than I can, but I mean, number one, population numbers. We don't have the population numbers that states in the East have. So if you want numbers of people voting, you got to include your full population, and that includes women. And we also had slightly different politics out here in the West. The Progressive Party really took hold out here in the West, and their philosophy was equality for all. So regardless of whether you were a woman or you were a person of color, they wanted to include you as a voter in their party. So progressive era politics and Governor Waite being elected as a progressive candidate is what opened up the doors to suffrage here in Colorado, certainly. But I think just, you know, as one of those articles said, it's the spirit of the West. We sort of have, you know, a different viewpoint on life than people in the East. And certainly at that time, it gets entangled with notions of manifest destiny, which we, of course, dismantle now. Thank you for recognizing, you know, Native Indigenous peoples in the land, because that was all a big part of this story. But I think there was just east of the Mississippi versus west of the Mississippi, just different ways of viewing life, and women were certainly allowed to play a stronger role at that time.
Sure. I mean, in any case, it's so interesting to see that the Western states were just such a forefront of this idea and movement here. All right. But Rebecca Debs wanted to add here that Western women showed how much they had to contribute because they helped build Western communities. Men saw this and responded accordingly. And this is in addition to all the things that you had said, Andrea. So it is really cool. But then the last question here, and feel free to send me any questions via email if you'd like, and we can try to get them answered the best we can. But then you mentioned that after her Senate run, Margaret went to France to help with World War I. Do you have any details of what she might have done there?
And this is the part of Margaret's life. There's this 5-year period where we have the fewest amount of sort of primary source documents or materials. So there's large gaps in what and plus when you think about it, it's wartime. So correspondence gets lost. You know, you can't carry all these things with you. So we know that by late 1914, Mrs. Brown makes her first trip to France. And then we know she comes back and forth several times over the next few years to gather medical supplies, nurses, to do some fundraising, but keeps going back and forth as travel allows. And women like Anne Morgan and Vanderbilt, you know, this whole cadre of women really set up medical relief nursing stations throughout northern France and Belgium on the front lines, because armies at that time typically didn't have the medical corps like we know they do today. So the Red Cross really gets mobilized, becomes closer to what it is today. And that's when you see suffragists sitting there having their suffrage meetings, and they're they're knitting gloves and socks for the soldiers. They're rolling bandages. As they're having these suffrage meetings, they're doing this war work. There was a great article too, I wanted to post but ran out of room, about how suffragists were growing potatoes to have on hand for the soldiers that were coming back wounded to the United States. And then in the aftermath of the war, Mrs. Brown, along with Anne Morgan, helped rebuild northern France. So they raised substantial money to rebuild schools and roads and things like that. And then Mrs. Brown paid for a rehabilitation hospital here in New York so that blinded soldiers could learn to read Braille. So she had the works of Mark Twain translated and things like that. So that's the sort of the bulk of what we know about Mrs. Brown in her wartime. We do have a letter from her to Senator Shafroth, and then Senator Shafroth back to her, where she's offering up her Newport house to be used as a war hospital. He declines, and I know they find another location, but that's how tied she was to some of those war efforts. But again, like with suffrage, she is just one of hundreds, if not thousands, of women who headed off to France to help with the war effort.
You know, it's almost like Margaret Tobin Brown lived so many lifetimes. And that's just another glimpse that could be a whole presentation, even with the limited information you have for that. But that really will do it for us today. And thank you so much for being here. Now, I understand it's July and this is Margaret Brown's birthday month. Are you all doing anything that you'd like to share with the audience?
Actually, yes. Thank you, Mike. So next Friday, we would love to have you join us for a fundraiser we're doing in honor of Margaret's birthday. and to sort of help us, recover after the closure. We are doing a birthday fundraiser event online for Mrs. Brown's birthday. So next Saturday would be her birthday, but we're doing the event on Friday night. And we have the pleasure of having Neela Pekarik of the Lumineers, who's going to do a live performance for us. And then we will also have a pre-cocktail event where you'll get to make cocktails from the Titanic with author Veronica Hinkey, and then a live performance. So depending on what level you want to commit to donating, we'll even drop off some cocktail and supplies and snacks to you, or you can pick them up. So it's going to be a really fun event, and it helps the museum out and helps us honor and celebrate Margaret's legacy.
That is amazing, and that sounds like a great time, and it's so creative to create this way to make it safe, And you can find information on that on mollybrown.org, is that correct?
That's correct, and yep, you can get your tickets.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Andrea. This has been such a pleasure. I know we'll see each other again soon, and who knows, with all these topics you brought up, I might call you again for this right here. All right, but going on here, we do have some more programs coming up. Now, in 2 weeks from now, on the 25th, you can join us and Dr. Judy Gahn to learn about another amazing suffragist here, and one of the first representatives here in the state, women representatives, Carrie Clyde Hawley. So please register for that. You'll find the links in there. But then going on, you will find that August, we have our 2 in this year's series, and then we'll continue on. But August 8th, we'll be learning about Susan B. Anthony and her whistle stop tour of Colorado before 1893. But then August 22nd, we will have Rebecca Hunt, Marcia Goldstein, and Gail Beaton to really give us an overview of women's suffrage movement in Colorado and the nation with the years respected there, called More Than Votes. So I hope you can join us for these culminating lectures in the series. And again, thank you so much, Andrea. And for the sake of time, we will have to end this here, but please, Michael.Erickson@state.co.us. You can send me questions and we'll do our best to get those answered for you, and join us in 2 weeks to have Judy Gahn come along. So thank you, everyone, and you all have a great weekend.